Right.
Okay. Okay, we can start. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to be the chair of this session, this talk and the next talk. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Professor Yuji Nagasawa from the University of Birmingham. Professor Nagasawa is the H.G. Wood Professor of Philosophy of Religion and the co-director of the Birmingham Center for Philosophy of Religion. He specializes in the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of mind, and applied philosophy. He is the author of Maximal God, A New Defense of Perfect Being Theism with Oxford, Miracles, A Very Short Introduction with Oxford as well, The Existence of God, A Philosophical Introduction with Routledge, and God and Phenomenal Consciousness, A Novel Approach to Knowledge Arguments with Cambridge. He's also the current editor of the academic journal Religious Studies and a former president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion. He currently leads the Global Philosophy of Religion project. The title of his talk today is Evil and the Problem of Impermanence in Medieval Japanese Philosophy. Professor Nagasawa, on behalf of myself and the organizers, let me thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Fabio and Nicola and their team for organizing this fantastic event. As Luis mentioned, I am currently leading a project called the Global Philosophy of Religion Project. And the aim of this project is to really globalize and diversify the field of the philosophy of religion. And Latin America is especially one of the areas that we focus on. So it's particularly exciting to interact with our friends in Brazil. So I'm really grateful to your invitation and this opportunity. So what I'm really interested in is, how central issues in the philosophy of religion would look differently from different religious or cultural perspectives. So in this talk, I focus on the problem of evil and try to address it from a Japanese perspective. So here is John Mackey, and he said as follows: the problem of evil, in the sense in which I shall be using the phrase, is a problem only for someone who believes that there is a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good. So this is what he said in his seminal paper called Evil and Omnipotence. And what he is saying here is that the version of the problem of evil, the logical problem of evil that he defends, is really a problem only for theists who believe that there is an omnipotent and wholly good God. So if you're happy to give up this concept of God, then his problem doesn't arise. But I have argued elsewhere that the problem of evil is a deeper problem. So I'm inclined to think that there are many different versions of the problem of evil, and they create challenges not only for traditional theists, but also for pantheists, panentheists, axiarchists, and even atheists. And in this paper, I want to go even further, and I want to examine whether there is a version of the problem of evil, even for Eastern philosophers. So here's the structure of this talk. So first, I will discuss Hojoki, which is a medieval Japanese work written by a monk called Kamono Chome. And in this book, Chome discusses all sorts of disasters and catastrophes that people experienced when he was alive. And then he raises all sorts of philosophical concepts that are relevant to the problem of evil. But then I argue that the problem that he's really problem he wants to focus on is not necessarily the problem of evil in the Western sense, but the problem that he wants to focus on is what I call the problem of impermanence, which is a distinct version of the problem of evil. And then I will address 4 responses to the problem of impermanence: hermetism, hedonism, indifferentism, and transcendentalism. And then I will argue that the first 3 responses are unsuccessful, and ultimately only transcendentalism has the potential to offer a successful solution to the problem. So I will conclude that in an interesting way, the problem of impermanence is an indirect argument for transcendentalism or supernaturalism and against naturalism. And then I will conclude our discussion. So let me start with Hojoki. So again, this is an essay or a book written by Kamono Chome in 1212. And Chome was a son of a Shinto priest, and later he was a lay monk, Buddhist monk. And then he records all sorts of disasters and catastrophes that people in Kyoto experienced within a 9-year period. And Kyoto was the capital of Japan then. And this work is considered one of the most important literary works in the Kamakura period, the medieval period in Japan. So let me very quickly introduce what kind of disasters Chome described in his work. So the first disaster that he talks about is a great fire in 1177. So there was a big fire in a crowded part of the town, and he describes as follows. For those caught up in the blaze, it must have seemed a nightmare. Some fell, choked with smoke, others were blinded by the flames and quickly perished. All human undertaking is folly, but it is most particularly futile to spend your wealth and trouble your peace of mind by building a house in the perilous capital. So what he says here is that, okay, he talks about this fire, which started as a form of natural evil, but it was amplified by moral evil. So he, partially blames people who build so many houses in a busy part of the city. So this is an interesting example where natural evil is amplified by moral evil. The second disaster that Chome describes is whirlwinds in 1180. Whirlwinds are basically tornadoes. So whirlwinds are quite common, but do they ever blow like this? This was no ordinary wind, and all wondered whether it was not some portent from on high. Mono no Satoshi, the karmic wind of hell itself would be such as this, it seemed. So what's interesting about his description here is that he wonders the possibility that this apparently natural evil was caused by supernatural beings. So the portent from on high is a translation of Mono no Satoshi, which means basically some warning from the above or from heaven. And the karmic wind of hell is a very hot, strong wind that is believed to blow in hell in response to human wrongdoing. So again, it seems that Chome is considering that whether this natural evil is caused by supernatural entities. So apparently natural evil is caused by supernatural entities. The third disaster that he addresses is a series of famines in 1180 to 1182. Disaster followed on disaster, and all the crops failed. In vain did the people till the fields in spring and plant in summer. Autumn and winter brought no bustling harvest, no storing up of food. Some as a last resort were going to run down all the temples, stealing the Buddhist images, dismantling the decorative woodwork in the worship hall, and breaking these up to sell. So people didn't have money, didn't have food, and they really starved. And in the end, they went to all the temples and dismantled Buddhist images so that they can sell them to buy food. And then Chome thought that this was a tragedy. And he thought that this is an example where natural evil entailed moral evil. So it started as natural evil involving famines, but it ended up with moral evil. So people started to steal things to eat. In this disaster, Chome also describes something a little bit more positive, or at least something that is not entirely negative. So he writes, where a man could not bear to part from his wife, or a woman loved her husband dearly, it was always the one whose love was the deeper who died first. In their sympathy for the other, they would put themselves second and give their partner any rare morsel that came their way. So this is what the Western philosophers call greater goods, realized through negative states of affairs. So sometimes, greater goods like love and compassion and altruism, these things are realized through tragedies. And Chome seems to be aware of this point. He also talks about a fourth disaster, but I will skip it because our time is limited. But it looks like Chome describes all sorts of disasters to illustrate philosophical concepts related to evil. So he talks about the distinction between natural evil and moral evil. He also talks about apparently natural evil caused by a supernatural being. He also talks about natural evil entailing moral evil and the greater goods realized through evil. He also has an example of horrendous evil, but I'm not going to talk about. So it looks like on the face of it, Chome is really talking about the problem of evil in the Western sense. But I argue that his focus is not necessarily on pain and suffering, which the Western problem of evil focuses on. His focus is more on impermanence. And this corresponds to the Buddhist distinction of the three marks of existence. So according to Buddhism, there are the following three marks of existence: suffering, impermanence, and non-self. So our existence necessarily involves suffering, and everything is impermanent. Nothing exists forever. And there is no such thing as the permanent self. There is no such thing as the self, according to Buddhism. And the first concept of suffering corresponds to pain and suffering, which the Western problem of evil tends to focus on. But I argue that Chome's problem of evil focuses more on impermanence rather than suffering. So I claim here that there are two versions of the problem of evil: the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of impermanence. So here is Chome's worldview. So he has a very dynamic view of reality. So here's a quote from Hojoki. So Chome writes, "On flows the river ceaselessly, nor does its water ever stay the same. The bubbles that float upon its pools now disappear, now form anew, but never endure long. And so it is with people in this world and with their dwellings. Death in the morning, at evening another birth. This is the way of things, no different from the bubbles on the stream." So this is really like Heraclitus. So, Heraclitus famously said that, you cannot step into the same river twice. And Chome has a similar view. Everything is transient and impermanent, and everything is constantly changing. And we are like bubbles in the water, because we are born at one point, but we will die sooner or later, and new people will be born, and so on. So he presents a very dynamic view of reality. And this is a picture of Kamo River in Kyoto today. And the name Kamo is linked to Chome's name, Kamo no Chome. Yoshida Kenko is another thinker and a writer who also has a similar view, dynamic view of reality. And his view is comparable to Chome's. Pain and suffering are apt illustrations of impermanence, but they are not essential ingredients. So Chome talks a lot about pain and suffering in the midst of catastrophes and disasters, but I argue that pain and suffering are not essential ingredients of the problem of impermanence, because the problem of impermanence can be presented by referring to pleasure and joy as well. So we can describe the problem of impermanence even in terms of something positive like pleasure and joy. So in Essays in Idleness, Yoshida Kenko writes, "Time passes, what was here is gone, joy and grief visit by turns, once splendid places change to abandoned wastelands." And also the Tale of the Heike, which is a war epic, which describes the rise and fall of the Taira clan, Taira family, says as follows: "The great man's certain fall, whose life is like a dream one night in spring, and the bold and brave who perish in the end." So we can describe the problem of impermanence by referring to even success and glory and joy and pleasure and all of these positive things. So we don't necessarily need to talk about pain and suffering. So here's a poem by Ariwara no Narihira. In the Japanese literature, you cannot find, they're not analytic philosophers, so you cannot find explicit formulations of their views. So we have to kind of extract their views from their poems and literary works. And this is an example. So Narihira writes, "If this world had never known the ephemeral charms of cherry blossoms, then our hearts in spring might match nature's deep tranquility." So, the Japanese are really obsessed with cherry blossoms. So if you have ever been to Japan, then you can see that on TV they show cherry blossom forecasting instead of weather forecasting, and they'll tell you exactly when you can see the full blooming of cherry blossoms. And I think that's because the Japanese associate cherry blossoms with life. So cherry blossoms are beautiful flowers, but not like strong, shocking pink flowers. They're only subtly beautiful, and they don't last forever. They last only for a week or so. There is something sad about cherry blossoms, and that represents a life, according to the Japanese. And what Narihira here says is that, in an ironic way, spring would have been calmer if there had not been the beauty of cherry blossoms. So cherry blossoms are so beautiful that he cannot feel calm because he knows that they don't last forever. So again, this is an example where impermanence can be illustrated in terms of something beautiful and something positive. So we often realize impermanence through the occurrence of negative events, but we can also recognize it through positive events. We could, of course, feel pain or suffering by observing the end of pleasure and joy, but pain and suffering are not essential ingredients to the problem of impermanence. Gomez and other Japanese authors' focus is on impermanence rather than pain and suffering themselves. So now I'd like to introduce 4 responses to the problem of impermanence found in the medieval Japanese philosophy. Obviously, they are not Judeo-Christian theists, so they are not interested in the compatibility between impermanence and the existence of God. Instead, these responses try to try to find out how we can understand, respond to, or cope with impermanence. So let me introduce 4 responses. The first response is hermetism. According to this view, we should live a simple life as a hermit and stay away from any potential disasters and catastrophes that we may encounter in civilization. So Chome, the author of Hojoki, he actually pursued hermetism. So he says that, after observing these catastrophes and disasters, he said that, the best way to live is to stay away from these disasters by living in seclusion. So he lived in the mountains in isolation. So here's a quote. The key to enduring our impermanent and ephemeral existence is to place ourselves in the right environment in which we can stay calm and feel ourselves from unnecessary concerns and worries. This world is a hard place to live, and both we and our dwellings are fragile and impermanent, as these events reveal. If you live in a cramped city area, you cannot escape disaster when a fire springs up nearby. Obviously, Chome's hermetism is based on Buddhist teaching. So Buddhism says that we should relinquish all worldly attachments and pursue equanimity, which is called sha in Japanese. So, Buddhism says that we have all sorts of attachments to material things and our reputation and fame and that kind of thing. We should get rid of these worldly attachments and desires to be happy. We should relinquish these attachments. And equanimity is a perfectly balanced mental state that is free from emotional disturbances and should be cultivated towards nirvana. So if we get rid of these attachments, then we can have a peaceful state, and we can be free from pain and suffering. And maybe that's the ultimate goal of nirvana. What's interesting is that hermetism is a lifestyle, and it's not a mere theoretical solution to the problem of impermanence. So this is one of the differences between a Western response to the problem of evil and the Eastern response to the problem of evil. So hermits, they are proposing a practical response, not a theoretical response. So this is a replica, this picture is a replica of Chome's 10-foot square hut. So he built a tiny house in the middle of the mountains, and he lived there in seclusion until his death. He wrote, the hermit crab prefers a little shell for his home. He knows what the world holds. The osprey chooses the wild shoreline, and this is because he fears mankind. And I too am the same. Knowing what the world holds and its ways, I desire nothing from it, nor chase after its prizes. My one craving is to be at peace, my one pleasure to live free of troubles. The second response that I want to introduce is hedonism. Hedonism also offers practical advice, but its advice contrasts sharply with that of hermetism. According to hedonists, we should pursue hedonistic pleasure and enjoy our impermanent existence as much as possible. So hedonists believe that we are impermanent. We will die sooner or later. So we should enjoy ourselves as much as possible. So here is a poem by Otomo no Tabito. He wrote a series of 13 poems in praise of sake. Sake is obviously rice wine. So he loves alcohol, and he writes like this. All living things die in the end. So long as I live here, I want a cup of pleasure. Obviously, the cup of pleasure is a cup of sake. And what he's saying here is that, okay, we will die in the end. So we should just enjoy our existence as long as we are alive. Here's another poem by Tabito. Grotesque. When I look upon a man who drinks no sake, looking wise, how like an ape he is. So this is quite a rude poem. He's ridiculing intellectuals. Hermits are typically intellectuals. So they intellectualize impermanence, and they decide to live in isolation in the mountains, and they read poems, and they read books and so on. So they are snobby intellectuals, according to Tabito. But he says that hedonism is a down-to-earth response that is available for everyone, including ordinary people. And what's interesting about the use of sake or alcohol is that when we are drunk, our elusive and dreamlike existence feels even more elusive and dreamlike. So these Japanese thinkers, they often use a dream as a metaphor for life, because when we realize that our life is temporary and transient and impermanent, we feel as if we are living in a dream. But when we are drunk, we feel, everything feels more dreamlike. So that's why some people say that hedonism is an attempt to go deeper into dreams. Here's one more poem by Tabito. Far better it seems than uttering pompous words and looking wise, to drink sake and weep drunken tears. I think this poem suggests that Tabito is not entirely content with hedonism. That's why he talks about weep drunken tears. By drinking, he cannot overcome the sad reality that everything comes to an end. So ironically, the more fun he has, the more vividly he realizes that his enjoyment will not last forever. The third response that I want to introduce is indifferentism. According to indifferentism, we should simply accept the impermanence of reality because there is no point in trying to overcome it. So indifferentism says that, okay, we are impermanent. Our existence is always temporary and we just cannot change it. So we just accept it and live our ordinary lives as ordinary people. So we have no control over it because we ourselves are fundamentally impermanent. And I call this a no response because it doesn't provide any positive response. It just accepts the problem of impermanence. Here's a quote from Kenko. So Kenko is, again, a hermit, but he is also self-critical. This is another interesting feature of these Japanese thinkers. So they defend a certain view, but they also criticize their own views. So here he's kind of defending indifferentism against his own hermetism. So Kenko writes, life is like the game of Mamakodate, which I think is like a game like of Othello. Soldiers going into battle, aware of the closeness of death, forget their home and their own safety. It is sheer folly for a man who lives secluded from the world in his lowly hut, spending his days in idle delight in his garden, to pass off such matters as irrelevant to himself. Do you imagine that the enemy impermanence will not come forcing its way into your peaceful mountain retreat? Again, he's criticizing himself as a hermit. So he lives in the mountains in seclusion as if he can avoid impermanence. But actually, soldiers might be better because they directly face impermanence and they recognize that their death might arrive at any moment. So in a way, they are taking impermanence more seriously than intellectuals like Kenko himself. So life is like a game which is guaranteed to end in our loss, even though we do not know when that will happen. Scholars intellectualize impermanence and willingly live as hermits, as if they can escape it. Soldiers who realize that their own death can happen at any moment know better than intellectuals because they face impermanence directly without pretending that it can be avoided. So that's indifferentism. And Saigyo is another hermit, but he also criticizes himself. And vow renouncement of the world, but cannot let it go. Some who have never taken vows do cast the world away. So what he's saying here is that, okay, he decided to live in seclusion. He decided to renounce the world and live as a hermit. But this very fact that he makes such a radical move may suggest that he is really attached to the world. He has a lot of worldly desires. And he says that ordinary people like farmers and merchants, they might be better than himself because they just accept impermanence and try to live ordinary lives as ordinary people. Okay, finally, this is the fourth response that I would like to introduce, and that's transcendentalism. According to transcendentalism, we can overcome impermanence by transcending our impermanent existence. So this view can be called going beyond dreams. So while the world is like a dream, there is an outer world that is more real, which we can wake up into. Our goal is to wake up from an elusive, dreamlike impermanent reality into a new transcendental reality. And that's why I say this view requires supernaturalism. There has to be something beyond our current impermanent reality. This is an excerpt of the Iroha song, which is basically an ancient Japanese alphabet song based on a Buddhist scripture called the Readings of Golden Light Sutra. Although its scent still lingers on, the form of a flower has scattered away. For whom will the glory of this world remain unchanged? Arriving today at the yonder side of the deep mountains of ever-sent existence, we shall never allow ourselves to drift away, intoxicated in the world of shallow dreams. So what this poem says is that we should realize our impermanent existence in the changing world by looking at the blossoming flowers, which despite their beauty will inevitably scatter in the end, and avoid absorbing ourselves into the dreamlike elusive reality and overcome impermanence by crossing the deep mountains of karma. So instead of just accepting impermanence, try to overcome this impermanence. There is something beyond our impermanent existence. And that's the other side of the deep mountains of karma. Here's a poem by Saigyo, another hermit. So he says, all in the world is a dream I see, and seeing its transience, yet still my heart does not awake. So what he says here is that he wants to wake up into the new reality, new transcendental reality, but he just cannot because he has so many worldly attachments. So it expresses his frustration. Okay, so I have introduced 4 responses to the problem of impermanence. And in this final section, I'd like to quickly assess the 4 responses. And I will reject the first 3 and defend the 4th one, transcendentalism. The problem of impermanence and the problem of pain and suffering are versions of the problem of what I call expectation mismatch. And I claim that understanding the problem of impermanence in this way, we can correctly assess the 4 responses. So there is the problem of expectation mismatch, and the problem of evil is one version of it. And there is also the problem of divine hiddenness and various other problems. And the problem of evil can be divided into 2 types, the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of impermanence. What I mean by mismatch is a gap between our expectation and reality. So let me explain. So here's the problem of pain and suffering, namely the problem of evil in the Western sense. So if we accept the Judeo-Christian concept of God, then at least our naive expectation would be that the world will be free from horrible things because the world was created by all-powerful, all-loving God. But the reality is the opposite. The world is full of wars and crimes and all sorts of horrible things. So there is a gap between our expectation and reality, and that's the source of the problem of pain and suffering. And we can find a similar structure in the problem of impermanence. So we tend to naively assume, or we pretend to forget that we are impermanent. So we live as if life will go on forever, or the world will exist forever. But the Buddhism teaches us that everything is impermanent. Our existence is always transient and ephemeral and so on. So nothing will last forever. So again, there is a gap between our expectation and reality, and that's the source of the problem of impermanence. So I will say that only transcendentalism can offer a potentially successful response. I'm not going to defend transcendentalism itself, but I will say that only this one has a potential to solve the problem. The problem of impermanence, therefore, poses a greater challenge to naturalism than supernaturalism, because transcendentalism requires supernaturalism. And I think this is an interesting outcome, because the problem of impermanence can be considered a partial argument for supernaturalism and against naturalism. The problem of evil is normally considered an argument for naturalism and against supernaturalism, but that's the other way around in this case. So let me assess Hermetism first. So Hermetism can be construed as an attempt to close the gap between our expectation and reality by minimizing negativity in reality. So Hermits try to live in isolation so that they will not suffer, they will not face disasters and catastrophes. So that's the way they try to avoid pain and suffering. So I say that this is the defensive response to minimize negativity in reality, and thereby they try to fill the gap between expectation and reality. Despite impermanence, we can still be content with life if we avoid the negative consequences of human wrongdoings and natural disasters by living in isolation. That's what Hermetism says. But I have three objections here. First, while hermits may be successful in avoiding certain types of pain and suffering, they may also inadvertently promote other types of pain and suffering. They may also inadvertently relinquish types of pleasure and joy that can be experienced only by living in civilization. So by living in isolation, they might avoid certain types of pain and suffering, but it's not very clear whether they can avoid other types of pain and suffering, or whether they can, whether or not they would lose certain types of pleasure and joy. Objection 2 is that hermits cannot escape negativity entirely by living in isolation, because birth, aging, illness, and dying are rooted in human nature. So if Buddhism is right, then we necessarily suffer because we are conditioned existence. So we cannot avoid suffering because of birth, aging, illness, and dying. And these things are rooted in our nature. But most importantly, Hermetism is at best a response to the problem of pain and suffering, not the problem of impermanence. Impermanence may be less visible to hermits because pain and suffering are highlighters of impermanence. Yet we cannot escape impermanence itself. So, I argued earlier that pain and suffering are only highlighters or illustrators of impermanence, and they are not the necessary ingredients of impermanence. So by avoiding pain and suffering, hermits might hermits might think that the impermanence is less visible, but that doesn't mean that they can avoid impermanence altogether. So it looks like hermits conflate the highlighters of impermanence with impermanence itself. So the second response that I want to assess is hedonism. So hedonism is an attempt to close the gap by maximizing positivity in reality. And I call it an offensive response. So hedonists, they try to fill the gap between our expectation and reality by maximizing positivity. So they want to promote pleasure and happiness by relying on alcohol. So they try to have fun so that we can fill the gap between our expectation and reality. And then they say, despite impermanence, we can still be content with life if we enjoy ourselves as much as possible. But again, I have three objections. So the first objection is identical to my first objections to Hermetism. So hedonists may be successful in promoting hedonistic pleasure and joy, but they may also inadvertently relinquish certain types of pleasure and joy. They may also inadvertently promote types of pain and suffering that arise only in hedonistic life. For example, alcoholics, they might suffer in different ways because of their reliance on alcohol. So it's not clear that they can really maximize pain and pleasure. The second objection is that hedonists cannot escape negativity by living hedonistically, because again, pain and suffering arise from birth, aging, illness, and dying, which are rooted in our human nature. So again, we are conditioned existence, and therefore necessarily we suffer. So even if we can try to enjoy ourselves by drinking alcohol, we cannot avoid pain and suffering entirely. The third objection, which is probably most important, is that hedonists' attempt to promote pleasure and joy can backfire, because pleasure and joy, as much as pain and suffering, can be highlighters of impermanence. So, as I argued earlier, the problem of impermanence can be illustrated by talking about pleasure and joy instead of pain and suffering. So by promoting pleasure and joy, they might actually realize more vividly that we are impermanent. So it's not clear that hedonism is a successful response to the problem of impermanence. So let me assess indifferentism. So indifferentism again says that we shouldn't do anything but simply live ordinary lives. Indifferentists accept reality as it is, and there is no need to attempt to decrease negativity or increase positivity. They accept just the axiological value of the world as it is, without trying to change it. Unlike hermetism and hedonism, indifferentism addresses the problem of impermanence directly. So in a way, I think this response is a coherent view, because it just accepts accepts reality as it is without trying to change anything. But there is one objection that I want to raise, which I call the paradox of indifferentism. So there cannot be genuine indifferentism as a response to the problem of impermanence. Once we recognize impermanence as a philosophical problem, we cannot just live ordinary lives as ordinary people. So let's say, I analyze the problem of impermanence as a philosopher, and then I conclude that indifferentism is the best response. So from tomorrow, I will live as a farmer, and I will give up philosophy. But this is not a genuine indifferentism, right? Because I became a farmer just in response to this philosophical problem of impermanence. So this is not genuine indifferentism, and it seems impossible to have genuine indifferentism as a response to the problem. So this is a paradox of indifferentism. But I would say this is a minor problem, and we can set that aside. And setting this aside, I would say indifferentism is a coherent, if not attractive, response to the problem of impermanence. So it's a little bit like pessimism. So life is life is not desirable, or not something that we really want to have, but we just have to accept it and live our lives. And that's a little bit similar to indifferentism. It accepts impermanence as it is and simply swallows it. And indifferentism is, however, not satisfying the solution to the problem of impermanence, because it doesn't offer any solution. It just accepts the problem. And that's why I'm most attracted to transcendentalism. So transcendentalism says that we can overcome impermanence by waking up into a new reality. And there are two versions of transcendentalism in the Eastern framework. The first one is what I call ineffable transcendentalism, and the other one is called permanent transcendentalism. Ineffable transcendentalism is based on Buddhism. So according to Buddhism, everything is impermanent. So if there are gods and Buddhas and heaven and hell and so on, even they are impermanent according to Buddhism. There's nothing permanent. So it's not merely that our current realm or our bodily existence is impermanent, but absolutely everything is impermanent according to Buddhism. And then Buddhism says that we should overcome impermanence by transcending impermanence rather than by denying impermanence or stipulating permanence. Buddhism places us in samsara, the continuous cycle of death and rebirth, and encourages us to escape from this cycle. There is no true self or permanent soul transmigrating in this system. our ultimate soteriological goal is nirvana, an ineffable and indescribable state of enlightenment, which represents an escape from the cycle. Nirvana is analogized to blowing out a flame, meaning ending the cycle of rebirth and death, a long process which involves states of being that are conditioned, impermanent, and unsatisfactory. No language or concept can fully capture such a state because it is unthinkable or incomprehensible by logic or reason. So nirvana is not the super existence or a permanent transcendental existence. It's not a permanent existence. It's something beyond impermanence. And this state cannot be described. That's why I call this ineffable transcendentalism. And the other version of transcendentalism is what I call permanent transcendentalism. And this is based on Hinduism. And this view affirms permanence as a transcendental state that we could try to reach. So impermanence applies only to the reality in which we currently live, and there is another permanent reality beyond that. We exist in an impermanent realm of conditioned existence, but this realm does not exhaust all of reality. So Hindus talk about the Atman, the permanent unchanging self that exists beyond phenomenality and external conditions. The Hindu belief in the Atman directly opposes the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. So this is probably the point that really clearly demarcates Hinduism and Buddhism. Let's skip the next bit. The Atman is an eternal, indestructible self that exists beyond the ego. We are part of samsara, and the jiva, the individual self, transmigrates into the body of another living being after death. If we take the right path, we will eventually achieve moksha, the blissful end of the cycle of death and rebirth, where we are finally freed from suffering. So there is some permanent state beyond our current impermanent reality. And transcendentalism, especially permanent transcendentalism, can be formulated in the Western framework as well. So Christians talk about God who exists eternally, or heaven, where God reigns eternally, permanently, and so on. So we can present transcendentalism in the Western framework as well. But I'm not interested in which version of transcendentalism is true here, because the crucial point here is that any version of transcendentalism requires supernaturalist ontology beyond impermanence. So there has to be something beyond impermanence, beyond the material spatial-temporal universe. Any such satisfactory solution to the problem of impermanence requires supernaturalism. And the problem of impermanence poses, therefore, a greater challenge to naturalists, or at least naturalists who reject indifferentism than supernaturalists. So if we believe that there is an ultimate optimistic solution to the problem of impermanence, we have no choice but to accept supernaturalism. So this is a 20-second conclusion of this talk. So I introduced Kamo no Chome's work, Hojoki, which describes all sorts of disasters and catastrophes in medieval Kyoto. And I argue that even though it appears that he's talking about the problem of pain and suffering, his real focus is on impermanence. So he's raising the problem of impermanence rather than the problem of pain and suffering. And then I introduced 4 responses to the problem, and I argue that only transcendentalism has the potential to offer an ultimate solution. And I concluded that the problem of impermanence raises a greater challenge for naturalists than supernaturalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nagasawa. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. I am going to field questions for Professor Nagasawa. If you would like to ask a question, you may raise your hand on Zoom using the raise your hand function, or you may write the questions in the chat and I will read them. choose one of those two. We have a question in the chat here, Professor Nagasawa. Let me read that for you. This comes from Ana Maria Correa. It says, I think that impermanence has to do with the idea of time flow. In Eastern transcendentalism, one is faced with an after-death life in which there is the eternal present of God and time doesn't pass. Do you think that in this case, we will overcome impermanence?
In which there is the eternal present of God and time doesn't pass. Yes, I think that's a form of transcendentalism, according to me. So if there is eternal or a timeless existence after our death, and we are, I don't know, perhaps we face God who exists atemporally or eternally, and we are part of it. And that kind of view is definitely a version of transcendentalism. And I think that's compatible with my claim that there can be a version of transcendentalism in the Western framework.
Any other questions and comments? We have another question in the chat from Icaro C. Martins. Could we say that the problem of impermanence presupposes a kind of modal ontology, something like omnicontingentism? If so, then a way to transcendentalism is to show that omnicontingentism is false.
What is omnicontingentism?
Ikaru, would you like to clarify this?
Maybe he means that everything is contingent.
So there's nothing necessary. Maybe the idea is that if Buddhism is right in saying that everything, absolutely everything is impermanent, that perhaps means that everything is contingent. So nothing exists necessarily.
That's right. He has qualified. He has clarified, and that's what he means, Professor. The thesis that everything that exists is contingent.
Okay. Yeah, contingency is a little bit tricky here because this is a modal notion, and it's not about temporality. And it looks like Buddhists, they are really talking about temporality rather than modality. But I think the suggestion is quite interesting. I guess the question is if if contingentism is false, and if there are things that are necessarily existent, then does that mean that some kind of transcendentalism is true? I'm not sure. You could say that abstract objects exist necessarily, but I don't know what kind of significant implications that would have for this kind of Buddhist metaphysics, because our interest is really for us to overcome our impermanence, or the impermanence of the world. So even if there are necessarily existent abstract objects, maybe that's not really a satisfactory solution to the problem of impermanence that we are interested in here.
Okay, we have a hand raised from Ricardo Tassinari.
Thank you for your excellent talk. I would like to know if do you think that we could compatibilize permanent transcendentalism with the concept of love of the yesterday talk of Professor Kelly?
I wasn't at Kelly's presentation, so I'm not sure what it is.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Would you like to explain that, Ricardo, a little bit? You're muted right now.
it's a very difficult to reconstruct the talk because he analyzes the different concepts of love that happens in the Bible and finish with a concept of love that is in some way transcendent. Is because of that I link your presentation with him.
Okay,
But
so
I think I can explain all he talk.
okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so if there is some kind of transcendental love, and if love requires some kind of relationship among us or between God and us and so on, I think that this sounds very much like a form of transcendentalism. So, from what I heard, yeah, his view seems to be compatible with transcendentalism that I presented here.
We have two related short questions in the chat. First, Rodolfo asks you, have you thought about any connection between math and transcendentalism? And Hamza asks you, does the undesirability of permanence or immortality pose a problem for transcendentalism?
Between math and transcendentalism, and again, I'm not sure if we can show that mathematical objects exist eternally, or mathematical objects are transcendental existence. If that kind of view would have any interesting implications for the problem of impermanence or problem of evil, because again, we are interested in how we can cope with or how we can respond to our impermanent existence. So I think if you want to defend transcendentalism, you have to have something transcendental and relevant to our impermanence. So just by having mathematical objects as permanent existence, I don't know how comforting that will be for us. Some people defend a view like some four-dimensionalists seem to think that there's something comforting about this four-dimensional block, because it makes us think that these deceased family members and so on, they are actually existent. They are, it's not as if they used to live and they are completely gone. They are still in this metaphysical system. And maybe you can lead to something similar to that by talking about mathematical objects and other abstract objects, but probably you need some theory to bridge this kind of idea and the problem of impermanence itself, which is concerned with the impermanence of our life and our existence.
And there was the question about the undesirability of permanence or immortality, whether or not that poses a problem to transcendentalism.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So I wrote a paper on that topic. So in philosophy, there are a lot of arguments for and against the desirability of immortality. So some people say that immortality is not desirable because immortal life is necessarily boring. So we shouldn't want to be permanent. And actually, some of these Japanese medieval thinkers, they suggest that actually it's good that we are impermanent. We shouldn't try to be permanent, because life is good if it doesn't last forever. So there can be arguments like that. And then my general approach to these arguments for and against the desirability of immortality is that, okay, just like there are good lives and bad lives, there are good immortal lives and bad immortal lives, or immortal existence. So obviously some forms of immortality are not desirable. So William Lane Craig talks about a situation where some astronaut just takes a wrong pill so that he will live forever in isolation in outer space forever. And, this kind of thing is clearly not desirable, and that's not the form of immortality that we want. So yeah, I think this question is interesting in this because it teaches us that the mere permanence or mere immortality doesn't solve the problem. So we need the right kind of permanence or immortality.
Right. We have a hand raised in the chat. Kachi Jihezenji.
Yes. Well, first, thank you very much for the excellent talk. I was wondering, in transcendentalism, how do you cope with this impermanent existence in practice, in daily life? Because you want to, is this just, does this require, like in the Christian framework, a certain type of behavior, a certain type of way of living in order to achieve this this answer to impermanence?
Okay, so I think transcendentalism itself might not offer us any practical advice. So I think often these proponents of transcendentalism, they combine their view with Hermetism, or not necessarily hedonism, because hedonism is very anti-Buddhist. But Hermetism is an attempt to get rid of worldly desires so that we can reach nirvana. So we can understand Hermetism as a step towards transcendence. So you might think that actually Hermetism and transcendentalism, they are not necessarily incompatible. It's just that Hermetism doesn't solve the problem of impermanence itself. It's just a step towards transcendentalism. So you can think of Hermetism as a view that would give us, practical advice on how we should live and, what kind of approach to life we should have. Maybe that's what some of the hermits have in mind when they try to talk about waking up into new reality. So, for example, Saigyo is the poet and the hermit that I mentioned, and he says that he wants to get rid of all the worldly desires, but he cannot do, and he cannot wake up into a new reality. And this seems to suggest that he's a hermit. He pursues hermetism as a way of life. But ultimately, what he wants is transcendentalism. So maybe that's one way of understanding these views.
We are running out of time here, and there are 4 questions in the chat. I'm just going to read you one of those questions, Professor, and perhaps you can later address them in the chat yourself. So here's one question from Nicola. I was wondering whether the problem you have outlined here is more a problem of human suffering and how to deal with suffering, rather than a classic problem of evil. If there is no supreme being, such as the Judeo-Christian God, that we can accuse of allowing evil, can we talk about a problem of evil in the first place?
Right. So what I can think of is that so Michael Tooley has a distinction between the axiological problem of evil and I forgot the other term, but the other one is a normative problem of evil. So according to the normative problem, it's not about good things and bad things in the world, but it's more about what kind of action God ought to take. So God appears to be failing to take responsibility for certain things that he does and he doesn't do. And that's one way of formulating the problem of evil. But the version of the problem of evil or pain and suffering that I mentioned is more like the axiological problem. And that's because, for people in non-theistic traditions, the normative problem doesn't arise. So there is no God who is responsible for or not responsible for evil in these frameworks. So here we have to formulate a problem of evil in terms of axiology. So the amount of pain and suffering in this world and what it teaches us about our worldview. So I think you're right that the problem that I've formulated is slightly different from a certain version of the problem of evil discussed in the West.
Thank you, Professor Yuji Nagasawa. This was great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting comments. They are very helpful.
Great. We will, in a few minutes, once we're set up here, we'll begin our next lecture with Professor Pitts. So please stick around for a little bit more of that. There we go.
Can you see that, or is it black for you?
It's black at the moment.
Yes.
Trying to remember what the solution to this is. I've had this happen before. Shall I email my slides?
If
What's
this
the
doesn't-
issue?
And maybe you didn't have chosen the right
Option to
option
share
to
the slides.
share with us. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Maybe turning off the sharing screen and
Yes, and choosing again.
yes.
Same. Let's
It-
see
it-
here.
Yes.
Still
So-
black?
Please stop
Stop the sharing.
share
Yes.
for a few seconds and choose again the option of your slides.
So I'm doing a new share. Probably no better. I remember having this problem before and solving it. Let's see if I can figure out
Please,
how.
Professor, send the slides to my mail and I can share this. Is PDF?
You could also you could also try, Professor Pitts, if your slides are in presentation mode, try sharing your screen without the presentation mode on.
My slides are a PDF file.
Okay. I allowed again you to share your screen. So please, you may try also again.
Thank you. Let's see here. Still showing me black, so it'll probably show you black as well.
Yes, it's black.
Okay.
You said the program, the software is presenting in as a black screen.
Yes,
didn't
I think
have
this has to do with it involves something about my graphics card,
Okay.
which I may or may not be able to do anything about in the allotted time. Let's see here.
Okay.
But maybe I can.
Perhaps emailing the slides to Fabio would be. Oh, there.
Or sending through the.
I'll do that. That'll probably take about 2 minutes because I have to recompile them in LaTeX, but and it'll reduce the number of slides, but that's what I'll do. Let's see here. Stop share. Oh, sorry, this is so interesting for everyone. Maybe Zoom has a new bug.
These are the perils of Zoom conferencing.
Okay, I think I'll have it in about 1 minute. Okay, and let's see, is it Bertato address, or to whom shall I send them?
Yes, please.
Okay. So maybe some of you are going to ask hard questions in the Q&A that I can't answer. So now I'll be able to escape the questions, right?
There's plenty of time between your lecture and the next lecture, so don't worry about that.
And questions will
Okay.
always arrive, right?
Okay, sent. Okay, has anything arrived yet?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So I sent them to Fabio's Yahoo address.
Okay, I'm open the file.
Great, thanks.
There we go.
Good, thanks. Sorry for all the trouble.
Let me, I will introduce you, Professor Pitts, and you will have up to about 50 minutes for your talk, and then we'll have some questions and comments afterwards. I will call on people who raise their hands via the Zoom function. And just as a reminder to everyone, anytime during the lecture, if you want to write a question or a comment on the chat, I will keep track of those and read them back to the speaker at the end. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce our second speaker for today, Professor John Brian Pitts from the University of Lincoln. Professor Pitts is a philosopher of science interested in the physical sciences, especially space, time, and gravity, interested in general philosophy of science, in early modern history of science and intellectual history, and in the philosophy of mind, among other things. He earned his PhD in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Notre Dame in 2008 with a philosophy concentration, and also a PhD in physics at the University of Texas at Austin in 2001. Professor Pitts has won grants from the John Templeton Foundation and from the National Science Foundation. The title of his talk today is What Does Reichenbach-Schur's Meta-Induction Justify? Induction or maybe something else? Professor Pitts, on behalf of myself and the organizers, let me thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for accommodating the technical issues. Still not quite sure what happened there. So next slide, please. Great, thanks. So yeah, I'll be. This will be maybe my attempt at some global philosophy of religion, having to do with some issues in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion and some medieval philosophy, and well, a variety of things. So, so let's see how that all works together. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so science is supposedly empirical and is often viewed as opposed to a priori knowledge claims. We might contrast that with, say, the strict empiricism of David Hume. Part of what Hume is remembered for is the problem of induction, although it has ancient roots in Sextus Empiricus. So as Hume knows, we haven't experienced tomorrow, so we have on empirical grounds no guarantee that bread will stay nourishing or that the sun will rise. The course of nature may change, all events are loose and separate, and anything can follow anything. So with such a view, it seems that such a change in the course of nature isn't impossible, and indeed it isn't even improbable. What we're left with, apparently, is that we expect the uniformity of nature as a non-rational habit. It's one that can be it's a belief that can be given up when doing philosophy, and then it kind of reappears when playing backgammon with one's friends, as Hume says at some point. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some people who are enthusiastic proponents of science have been quite worried about what happens if one cannot solve this problem. And in particular, I have in mind logical empiricists such as Hans Reichenbach, Wesley Salmon, and Gerhard Schurz, who, though a contemporary, also regards himself as a logical empiricist. So it would seem to me that science is needing exceptionless uniformity, and the rejection of contrary testimony would be especially vulnerable. Compare condensed matter physics, which attempts to tell you about what happens presumably with all solid matter, with cosmology, which aims to talk about the unique history of the universe. So also, if the problem of induction is not solved, then Hume's critique of miracles seems to be blunted. This was something that was pointed out in the 18th century by the Abbé Bergier, evidently, as this author Bonhoeffer talks about, and C.D. Broad discussed a century or so ago. Another theme that's kind of related is the idea that skeptical philosophy might be an aid to faith. You can find such thoughts perhaps in St. Paul, Tertullian, Al-Ghazali, Montaigne, Pascal, Bishop Way, Pierre Bayle, Hamann, Bergier again, Kierkegaard, maybe Shestov, and certainly Popkin, Richard Popkin being the premier historian of philosophical skepticism, passed away fairly recently, and also a religious Jew and sympathetic to this strain of thought himself. So most, not with those religious interests in mind, many significant English language philosophers in the 20th century worked on solving the problem of induction, but that basically ended in exhaustion and failure. So what it seems to be left with, at least according to Kohlenhausen, is Bayes' theorem and your opinions, or my opinions, which seems to push in a relativist direction. Next slide, please. Although Hausen didn't emphasize that because presumably he didn't like it. So moving back a little bit historically to the late Renaissance. So in the 16th and 17th century, Sextus Empiricus, his works were rediscovered and became very widely discussed, and is very influential. There are various people, at least some of whom were sincere, particularly among French Catholics, who saw as a skeptical philosophy as an aid to faith. So some people from various directions complain. Some people think skeptical arguments shouldn't be used for faith. Some people think that faith isn't served by skeptical arguments. But Popkin, who I think is at least as entitled to an opinion as most people, actually sympathizes with the idea that skeptical philosophy is indeed a sort of warm-up for faith. So that's at least, I think that's an indication that this is a serious response to these sorts of arguments. Next slide, please. So I want to sketch a suggestion for maybe why philosophical skepticism was significant into maybe the start of the 18th century, and then kind of disappeared for a while in most respects. I see Hume as an outlier here in various ways, in some ways pointing back, in some ways pointing forward. And then skepticism, I think, became important again in the 20th century. So in, say, the Renaissance or early modern era, there were people, at least, who would use skeptical arguments and say, well, this is a good way to warm up for religious faith. Other people didn't like that, but some did. With the Enlightenment, one has an optimistic, rationalistic idea. So God exists, but he's too reasonable for all the miracles and prophecy that people have been arguing about. And so God solves the skeptical problem without creating a new one because he's an Enlightenment sort of God. So God justifies induction and ethics, but doesn't cause any trouble. And I don't think Kant is really terribly different. And for Kant, there's sort of a transcendental postulation of basically the same thing. But of course, the rationalist God didn't have much to do and eventually got fired. And so if one accepts that move, then one no longer seems to have any synthetic a priori knowledge. You don't know anything in advance other than maybe what your words mean. So the logical empiricists in the early 20th century, for example, felt the need to face Hume's problem of induction quite seriously when they gave up on Kant. Thank you. So the logical empiricists made a major effort to justify induction. There's some early work by Feigl, but much of it was by Hans Reichenbach and his student Wesley Salmon, who was once described as fighting a one-man war on this issue. In our century, Gerhard Schurz has been fighting a war of his own, you might say, and justifying induction, although with some collaborators. And Salmon and Schurz, at least, are clear that they're aiming to defend science against relativism and various esoteric worldviews, maybe involving fortune telling or Orthodox Abrahamic religions. So they want to justify induction to make the world safe for science and free of religion, you might say, or at least of a traditional sort. So in giving this list, I don't want to suggest that all of these ideas are equally valuable or even mutually consistent, but just these are some of the things that Salmon and Schurz aim to oppose. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the way that these logical empiricists have tried to justify induction goes by the name of the pragmatic, or more recently maybe meta-inductive justification of induction. So they're not trying to show that inductive predictions will come true. You know, maybe bread will stay nourishing, maybe not. They're not even trying to show that it probably that inductive predictions probably will come true. So you can't even say that bread will probably be nourishing, according to the pragmatic or meta-inductive justification of induction. Rather, all you can say is something like, it's the best bet. You know, maybe there's no way to predict the future, but if anything will work, prediction using induction will work, and therefore the smart money is on induction. So how do you say that this is the best? Well, basically, you look at various possible ways of predicting the future. Maybe you do science, maybe you consult a crystal ball, and then you keep track of how well these various ways work. And you are supposed to conclude that induction is the best. It may not, it's not guaranteed to work. It's not even probable necessarily, but if anything works, it will work. And that is less than you might want, but it is substantial and perhaps good enough. And so Schurz subtitles his recent book, The Optimality of Meta-Induction. Next slide, please. Now, I haven't actually said why meta-induction. So you might think induction, and Reichenbach talks about induction, but what it's actually looking at is a sort of meta-level, higher level induction over predictive methods. It's not assuming a uniformity of nature. It's rather saying, you try to predict the future using science. I try to predict it using a crystal ball. Or maybe you have one favorite weather forecaster. I have a different weather forecaster. Meteorologists are actually some of the biggest users of this kind of thinking. So there's this induction over predictive methods in light of their track records. So what I have to say that I think has some novelty is I want to call attention to an underemphasized historical assumption in this argument, and that is that science or the uniformity of nature has in fact worked best so far. Not that I am here to deny that claim, necessarily, but Schurz is quite clear that he is trying not to beg the question. And he's trying to convince people who believe in predicting using crystal balls or Bible reading or the like, that they should stop and use science instead. So I think it's quite legitimate, therefore, to call attention to this under-recognized premise. So, if you grant the premise that the uniformity of nature has outperformed all rivals so far, then the pragmatic justification of induction gives you a reason to think that it will continue to do so. And this is a conclusion that's strong enough to matter, but weak enough to be defensible, apart perhaps from the worry that I've raised. Next slide, please. Okay, so people like Schurz say, we want to be radically open, in advance at least, to any ways of making prediction, and then only let the data speak. So let's suppose I have a toy 8-ball. So you shake one of these things and it floats in some kind of liquid, and it gives you a brief answer. So I ask it, 8-ball, do you predict reliably? And then it says, yes, definitely. So if I'm really convinced that magic 8-ball prediction works, then I might be in good shape here because, hey, it's also self-recommending. That's a consistency test that I've passed that in principle I could have failed. On the other hand, next slide, please. Thank you. On the other hand, maybe my magic 8-ball is not magical after all. So here's Hans Reichenbach in his book, Experience and Prediction. The clairvoyant might be an imposter. That's the reason why we cannot admit clairvoyance without control. We demand the forecast of the clairvoyant and compare it with later observations. If then there is a good correspondence between the forecasts and the observations, we shall infer by induction. I might say that you should probably have said meta-induction here, but maybe the word hadn't been invented. Shall infer by induction that the man's prophecies will also be true in the future. This distinctive position of the principle of induction is due to the fact that we know about its function of finally leading to the true value of the limit, whereas we know nothing about the clairvoyant. In other words, induction sort of tends to find regularities if there are any. On the other hand, if my magic 8-ball doesn't predict the future accurately, then asking it whether it predicts the future reliably does not give me any useful evidence. And so I can't just start with some sort of esoteric approach. Thank you. Okay, good. So as I mentioned, Shorts and Salmon are quite eager to show that they are not begging the question. They are, after all, sincere empiricists. And so one is allowed on this view to entertain all manner of esoteric prediction methods. So if you were living in the days of the prophet Elisha, you would be welcome, as far as Shorts and Salmon are concerned, to consult the prophet Elisha and then look at the track record and see whether you ought to believe such things. And Shorts thinks that his argument should show such people that one actually cannot reliably predict the future using prophecy, and one should use science instead. On the other hand, he does not worry seriously, and I don't think worried at all prior to his book, that such people might themselves invoke meta-induction. In other words, there's the assumption that meta-induction is on the side of science and not on the side of prophecy, even though Reichenbach, as we have seen, briefly did entertain the other possibility. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there is a recognized problem in the philosophy of science literature for this justification of induction, and that is called the short run problem. And indeed, Reichenbach already was aware of the problem in general outline because he imagined some way of making predictions that agrees or approximates scientific prediction eventually, but does not exactly agree. And as Salmon points out, the short run is what really concerns us. Or as Michael Friedman says, and I'll paraphrase here, science will work someday, but what if it doesn't work for a million years? Maybe fortune telling will outperform science for the next million years. So nothing in the pragmatic justification of induction rules that out. So I conclude that there is room potentially for some kind of esoteric prediction method to outperform science as long as the esotericist doesn't say very much. In other words, suppose you live like 99% of your life using science, and then every once in a while you make your predictions based on prophecy. If you prophesy or you use prophecy sufficiently rarely, then you're not obviously going to run afoul of the fact that airplanes work based on science and so on. So maybe occasional prophetic predictions would be permitted, but or not ruled out using this kind of argument because of the short run problem. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, and not coincidentally, I don't think any real person has ever thought that induction usually fails. Now, why do I mention this? Well, it's because the literature on the justification of induction has traditionally used a handful of alternatives. One, induction works, and then another one would be, well, maybe the opposite of induction works. And then another one would be maybe totally random prediction. But of course, no real person has ever taken seriously either counter-induction or random prediction. What anyone would think is uniformity of nature works at least most of the time, but maybe my favorite prophet works on occasion as well, or maybe not. But the point is, this is a disagreement over a relatively small part of life. And so the literature on justification of induction has tended not to engage with serious alternatives. It's progress, however, that recently Shorts and Thorne have come up with a word to describe this distinction. So persistent players deliver a prediction for each event, while intermittent players do not. So the point I want to make is any serious alternative that anyone has actually believed would involve some sort of intermittent prediction that is non-scientific as opposed to a persistent one. For example, I don't think Jewish or Christian gynecologists would take Sarah's bearing Isaac after menopause or the Virgin Mary's bearing Jesus as precedents. They don't think, well, this might well happen again because it happened once, or according to a key religious story or something like that. So the rivalry, if any, is between induction with a few exceptions and exceptionless induction. And that, I think, fits quite well with the traditional short-run worries, unlike the rivals traditional in the literature on the justification of induction. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Schurz says quite clearly that he wants to provide an argument that should convince non-naturalists. And he thinks that in 2008, this was still necessary. So you might have thought the Enlightenment achieved something important centuries ago, but apparently an awful lot was left to do. So here, according to Schurz, he says, it seems that so far, none of these attempts has been successful in giving a positive justification of induction, which establishes in a non-circular manner that the inductive method is a superior prediction method in terms of its success frequencies. Let me emphasize that this is neither obvious nor guaranteed. Millions of people do, in fact, believe in superior non-inductive methods, be it God-guided inner intuition, clairvoyance, or other supernatural abilities. Now, I might qualify that people who believe in these things do not believe in them full time. But in any case, Schurz regrets that people believe in these at all, and he wants to change that. So he's striving to provide an argument that does not beg the question. So people in the literature on the justification of induction tend to regard the problem as basically a 20th century problem, or maybe stretching all the way back to the 19th century in Charles Sanders Persp. But I want to suggest that it actually goes back to the ancient world. It can be found, for example, in ancient Israel, perhaps elsewhere as well, with philosophical treatment by the Stoics in their defense of divination. So is meta-induction a logic of science, or is it maybe a logic of faith, or both? The Stoics actually thought both, as it turns out. And recall Reichenbach briefly entertained the idea that meta-induction could, in principle, justify some kind of clairvoyant predictions. Thank you. So here's Cicero. It's debated what Cicero's own views are. Increasingly, people don't assume that his heart is in book 2. Anyway, in book 1, he has a character named for his brother defend divination, and the arguments are basically Stoic arguments. Unfortunately, the Stoic originals are lost to us, so it's good that we have Cicero. So as I hinted at earlier, the Stoics thought the same kind of argument could justify both science and divination, although they realized that one of them is something we can understand and the other one isn't. So when you have a successful track record of divinations, that justifies both believing determinism, otherwise how could the future be known, and divination. In other words, this sort of prophecy does work or has worked so far, so it will probably work again. So the pro case is presented by Cicero's brother Quintus, who gives example after example of fulfilled divinatory predictions as reason to expect further reliability. In other words, Quintus's argument is a form of meta-induction, which is, I think, akin to Reichenbach's entertaining clairvoyance, except this is real. Possibly Cicero intended this seriously. Cicero was actually part of the Roman state divination apparatus, and so he may well have believed in what he was doing. In any case, Chrysippus did, and so this actually goes back to the ancient world. So here is Quintus's character. Speaking now of natural divination, that means something like a human prophesying as opposed to looking at which way birds fly or whatever. Everybody knows the oracular responses which the Pythian Apollo, this is the oracle at Delphi, gave to Croesus, the rich guy, to the Athenians, Spartans, and some other people. Unfortunately, we no longer do. Anyway, Chrysippus has collected a vast number of these responses, attested in every instance by abundant proof. The oracle at Delphi never would have been so much frequented, so famous, and so crowded with offerings from peoples and kings of every land, if all ages had not tested the truth of its prophecies. What cannot be denied without distorting the entire record of history is that the oracle at Delphi made true prophecies for many hundreds of years. Okay, so I'm not here to defend the oracle at Delphi, and I don't even know what most of the examples were, and probably no one does anymore. The point is, this is meta-inductive reasoning being used by Cicero and by the Stoics in defense of a Greek form of prophecy. So divination could involve a human speaking, or it could involve other things like whether a bird flies to the left or to the right, which isn't very preternatural, admittedly. But I think we can see that meta-induction has been a logic of prophecy already for millennia, or at least it was millennia ago. So we've seen that for the Greek case. I haven't shown you the Jewish case yet, but that's coming up. Now, for the Stoics, there's no rivalry between science and divination because they apply to different domains. There's no science for the things that you ask an oracle about. On the other hand, for the Bible, there is occasional rivalry, but at least according to the Bible, prophecy outpredicts science on those rare occasions where they both have something to say. And this makes it rather tricky to sift the historical data, particularly in light of the problem of induction. If you have the problem of induction, it's hard to know that impossible things can't happen. On the other hand, much modern biblical criticism has been premised on the idea that physically impossible things, well, are really impossible. But if induction is in doubt, then you don't really actually know that. Thank you. So on to the Hebrew case. So as many of you will be familiar with this story, others perhaps not. This is in the book of Genesis. So Abraham and Sarah are old. So Abraham is the grandfather of the guy for whom the nation of Israel is named. So they're old, they have no child. And so Sarah decided to help God out a bit and said, Abraham, why don't you take my maidservant Hagar as your concubine? And in so doing this, I mean, you're supposed to be disappointed in this, but they were following the science. And it worked because Ishmael was born. So, I mean, theologically, whatever the theological value of this act is, of course, we're supposed to be disappointed. Medically, this was sound reasoning because Sarah was past menopause, we were told. Okay, so even though this works, God was actually not satisfied and said, no, actually, Sarah is going to have a son. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. So there you go. The mother is Sarah, the descendant is Isaac, and he's going to have a whole bunch of children for a long time. So Abraham had an interesting career in religion and science, you might say. God promised a birth to Sarah by Sarah, even though she was post-menopause. And while medicine was at best rudimentary at that stage, it was nonetheless well known that that it was not possible to have children there. And yet Isaac was in fact born. So the promise, God's promise of descendants starts to work. There's a little bit of a track record here in which God's promise is successful. But of course, the promise requires Isaac to have descendants, which requires him to marry. Like I said, maybe repeating myself there. Anyway, that seems to exclude his dying early, or at least his staying dead, which leads us to the next event, in which in chapter 22, God tells Abraham to offer Isaac as a human sacrifice. Sacrifice him there as a Mount Moriah as a burnt offering. And so Abraham undertakes to obey. And as he's about to do it, the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. And fortunately, we have a picture. There we go, by Caravaggio. So this is what it looked like. Next, please. Thank you. Okay, so how did Abraham reason? Well, the account is actually very brief, so we're not really told, but we can, to some degree, reconstruct what he was thinking. Perhaps God had promised descendants through Sarah and thus Isaac, and had fulfilled step one through Sarah, even though she was after menopause. And the promise of descendants through Isaac required Isaac to survive. So if Isaac believed the promise, then obeying the command to sacrifice Isaac somehow did not imply that Isaac would die, or at least that he would stay dead. So insofar as he believed the promise, sacrificing Isaac was not obviously absurd or immoral because Isaac would have to survive somehow. Now, Abraham in this event, in particular, is viewed as a paradigm for Jewish and Christian faith, although read in various ways. On some readings, I think probably more common among Christians, there's a hint of resurrection here. One thing I think is interesting about meta-inductive reasoning is it can make surprisingly much sense of a seemingly bizarre story. I think that's perhaps preferable to finding absurdity and embracing it. Telling some people that this is absurd and yes, you should believe it doesn't necessarily convince everyone. Okay, so in the New Testament, the author of the book of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. Hence, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. The point here seems to be, at least according to this New Testament author, Abraham figured that even if he killed Isaac, Isaac would stop being dead, which was a remarkable thing because that had never happened before, as far as we have in the Bible anyway. All the resurrections happened later. And Aquinas seems to go along with this as well, with this reading. So Abraham's undertaking to sacrifice Isaac more or less makes sense. This is not simply absurdity or some sort of pure grace or something along those lines. It actually more or less makes sense in terms of inductive logic, because recall, prophecy had outperformed science before in the birth of Isaac in the first place. So I think we have a hint here that meta-induction is a sort of tacit logic of faith. Okay, so on to Moses. So again, this story will be familiar to many. So Moses and God rescued Israel from Egyptian slavery via miraculous plagues and parting the Red Sea, which drowned Pharaoh's army. And this gave a track record as reason to expect fulfillment of further predictions by Moses and God, namely that they would conquer the promised land of Canaan, despite their having non-combatants, having presumably fewer poor weapons, having little experience going up against walled cities, which were defended by iron chariots and apparently people who were very tall. So this seems from a military standpoint like a very unpromising undertaking. Nonetheless, after the Exodus, Israel and 10 spies, well, there were 12 spies, but 10 of them reasoned along these lines, followed inductive military science and doubted that God would enable them to conquer the promised land. Now, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, one's supposed to think that these people are bad. These aren't the people who get halos on stained glass windows. On the other hand, they were following solid military science of the sort that, at least in some countries familiar to me, gets taught in universities. So here we find the Israelites making an inductive prediction. All the people of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. Why does the Lord bring us into this promised land of Canaan to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become a prey. So the usual religious law says these people are displaying unbelief, but they are, I would emphasize, following inductive military science. So this is kind of odd because unbelief is bad, at least if you have Jewish or Christian faith, but science is good. So, so what gives? Well, there are the other two spies, Joshua and Caleb. These are the ones who get the halos on stained glass windows. They expect prophecy to outperform military science. They say, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. So you might wonder, did Joshua and Caleb reason meta-inductively? Well, we're not told, but we are told that God did. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs which I have wrought among them? In other words, God's saying, I have a track record of fulfilled predictions, busting you out of Egypt, so you should meta-inductively expect me to bust you into Canaan as well. So it seems that Torah faith has a logic, and the logic is meta-induction. And once you find it there, you can also find it lots of places. You can find it in the Psalms, the prophets, the historical books, and also in the New Testament. So I'll give one example from an historical book. So the law of Moses says, don't make foreign alliances and don't be afraid of your enemies because God will defend you, even if your army is small and lame. But after David's son Solomon, Israel split into the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. In 2 Chronicles 14, Judah's king Asa, so Judah was a rather small kingdom, so Asa removed all the idols and false gods. So this was a religious reform that the writer endorses. But then Judah was attacked by a huge army led by Zerah the Cushite. So this would be from the southwest. So his response was prayer. And then God defeated the Cushites. So the promise that God would defeat their enemies seems to be working rather well for Asa here. But then 2 chapters later, when Asa is facing a probably smaller problem of war against Israel and Syria, Aram, he resorts not to prayer, but robbing the temple in Jerusalem and buying off the Syrians. So this was a rather worldly approach, you might say, even after the success of the more spiritual approach. And the prophet Hanani comes to Asa and says, because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war. So I think it's clear here that Hanani was using meta-induction. Or whoever wrote this story, if you don't believe it really happened as written, somebody was using somebody wrote this such that Hanani was using meta-induction, appealing to God's track record of successful predictions of the people of Judah defeating their enemies even when their army is small and lame, and yet Asa instead defaulted to inductive military science 2 chapters later. So clearly Hanani is in favor of meta-induction. Okay, so a question I raised briefly is, did these stories really happen as written? Well, I'm not, even though I'm quoting them as though, even though I'm quoting them that way, that isn't actually a premise of the argument. So there are a couple possibilities here. If you think they did happen as written, then you thereby acquire a bit of a track record for meta-inductive expectation for further predictive success. At least if you can decide what, if anything, continues this predictive method, which gets you into questions of, what is the canon, which collection of people, writings, institutions, or whatever are the voice of God. And of course, there are old, complicated theological controversies about that issue. On the other hand, if you think that these stories didn't happen or didn't happen in much the way that they're written, that doesn't mean that my whole point is lost, because it still winds up the case that somebody wrote these stories a long time ago using meta-inductive reasoning, and hence many ancient pro-Yahweh ancient Hebrew writers tacitly hit upon the same informal argument, which is philosophically interesting. And this prior to the Stoic defense of divination on similar grounds. Now, I think it's quite clear from the text that I'm reading that there's not a lot of heavy philosophy involved. It's about, it's about battles and pregnancies and quite earthy things, and the reasoning is never spelled out. But we can now see what the reasoning is or could have been, and it has been vindicated by the logical empiricists as perhaps the best way of justifying science that is available in our day. They were, of course, aiming to justify induction rather than faith. Indeed, they were trying to refute faith in some Orthodox faith anyway, in some cases. But that doesn't take away from my point. Okay, so if it seems that there's something surprisingly logical going on in these rather earthy stories, which I think cast doubt on a couple influential views. And one would be a view of Mark Twain, who he has a character say somewhere, faith is believing what you know ain't so. And if you look into some of Twain's work, I mean, that does indeed express his attitude. He was, particularly later in life, a vicious critic of Christianity. So I think it's fair to attribute that character's remark to him. So what that seems to mean is there are, in Twain's view, rational standards for belief, and those standards exclude Christian and similar faiths. On the other hand, given meta-induction, it would seem that faith might be, at least given some people's putative evidence, the rational product of meta-inductive logic. In other words, if you are appropriately situated and these events actually happened, as described, then you may just be a good inductive logician if you expect the promises of God to continue coming true. Another view that I think is undermined is Wittgenstein's presumably sympathetic idea that religion is just not the kind of activity to which rational criteria are relevant, and that's just okay. So what I think one can see here is that Judeo-Christian religious epistemology at its roots is not some sort of holy pneumatic process. It's not just God somehow by grace causes faith. I mean, that such processes may well exist, but that's not the only thing going on. Rather, they essentially involve inductive logic, a phrase that I think one would be hard-pressed to find in most of the theological literature. Thank you. So I think one can see some old texts in a new light here, because meta-induction makes much of the Bible more philosophically interesting as inductive logic than one might have thought, because much of it purports to give a track record of God's successful predictions. This in the service of motivating further expectations of predictive success. So you will find, for example, frequent calls to recite the deeds of the Lord. So Lord in all capital letters is an English rendering of YHWH, the Hebrew tetragrammaton, which I wrote out above YHWH, to tell one's children about the deeds of the Lord, and so on, to say what God has done. So the point of all that turns out to be to convey the track record of God's successful predictions to short-lived meta-inductive reasoners, which of course is what we are. So this has been within the context of Stoicism to some degree and Judaism and Christianity. I'm quite unsure whether anything similar happens for Islam or Hinduism. I'm hoping to study African divination, given that the Stoic defense of divination has been so philosophically relevant. I could imagine there might be African resonances as well. So the big picture at this would look something like this. So one can, so induction, particularly if you have an empiricist standpoint, is subject to critique, but you might respond with a meta-inductive justification of induction, as logical empiricists do. On the other hand, there is this largely unremarked premise that induction has worked best so far. And I want to flag that as controversial because the same kind of reasoning has been viewed, has served explicitly as a Stoic logic of faith, and I think implicitly as a Hebrew logic of faith, using different beliefs about the past. So this is a way of drawing on the tradition that skepticism is an aid to faith, and yet without ending in skepticism. It seems to me that some of the things that people labeled fideists have wanted to say are attended to without a fideistic leap. And I regret the fact in particular that I couldn't attend Duncan Pritchard's talk. I'm kind of in and out due to other things that are going on that are largely outside my control. And with pretensions of philosophy thus critiqued, faith can go beyond reason without going against it. Okay, so which leads to, you might say, two Humes. If one cannot be sure that that bread will remain nourishing, then one cannot be sure that dead people will remain dead or blind people will remain blind. This is something that C.D. Broad remarked on a century ago. Broad was no theist, although he was quite interested in parapsychology. So in particular, he is indicating that Hume's critique of miracles, the subject of this article 100 years ago, fits particularly badly with Hume's critique of induction. So there are also interesting historical precedents for this, particularly in Islamic philosophy. So one of the more visible features of Islamic philosophy, at least as it's understood in the West, is a controversy over what we now refer to as Averroism, although Averroes was a somewhat late participant in it. So basically, Aristotelian natural philosophy, and which was viewed as having a strong notion of necessity, was long a rival of Orthodox Islam. And this made its way over to to Latin Christendom as well under the name of Averroism. Averroes being so faithful to Aristotle that he was called the commentator. So these Islamic Aristotelians would say things like, necessarily fire burns cloth. And therefore, it would follow that necessarily Abraham in the furnace, so in the Quran, Abraham is in a fiery furnace, and in the Bible, Daniel's in a fiery furnace. It doesn't really matter who was in a fiery furnace, I suppose. Necessarily, fire burns people. So it wouldn't be possible to prevent that. And this inclination of philosophers away from the Quran was quite bothersome to Al-Ghazali, who had a goal to convince followers of philosophy that prophetic miracles, which they thought were impossible, are in fact possible. And if they're possible, then the Quran's accounts could be literally true and do not need to be interpreted as metaphors. And how did he do that? Well, he used skeptical argumentation to make room for faith. So we might see the situation that Al-Ghazali faced from the very Aristotelian naturalistic philosophers as similar to what similar to the view that contemporary liberal theologians are quite similar to the Averroist, one might say, in saying that a prestigious natural philosophy prevents us from believing in things like resurrections. So here's Langdon Gilkey. Contemporary theology does not expect of or speak of miracles on the surface of natural and historical life. The Enlightenment makes us believe in science, and so on. At the end, suddenly a vast panoply of divine deeds and events recorded in Scripture are no longer regarded as having actually happened, according to Gilkey. On the other hand, the problem of induction is very rarely attended to in theology, at least not in a recognizable analytic form. I think there may be some broadly analogous continental or existentialist themes, but they tend to sound irrationalist, at least to the unsympathetic outsider. Now, if logical empiricism has done so much for theology, why has no one noticed? Well, the logical empiricists are mostly remembered by theologians for declaring theology to be meaningless, as Carnap did in an early work. And I don't think it's been noticed that the logical empiricists have largely sorted out the logic of faith, although I think it's clear from Reichenbach's remark on his brief aside, in fact, on clairvoyance, that they largely have. So I think analytic philosophy of religion and analytic theology, particularly with additional historical awareness, can be very helpful here. And I think modern skeptical theism has some interesting resonance with earlier ideas. Sorry about that. Earlier ideas that that skepticism is an aid to faith. Okay, so if one has the problem of induction in mind, then the views expressed by people like Gilkey, Schleiermacher, Trelch, Bultmann, and so on sound like either a bit philosophically innocent on the one hand, or perhaps the product of a coherent rationalist view, but a view that would admit alternatives. So Gilkey basically dismisses biblical evidence on which a meta-inductive conclusion could be reached if one is inclined towards meta-inductive reasoning. So is a priori knowledge of induction available? Well, if it is, then Gilkey's in good shape. On the other hand, it's pretty hard to meet the empiricist critique of induction without some sort of dogmatic postulation. And Arthur Burks, one of the philosophers who invented computer science, said we should make a dogmatic postulate there. Schwartz doesn't think we should make a dogmatic postulate and says we need to use meta-induction instead. I think these theologians could, and perhaps did, postulate a rationalist God who just wouldn't do miracles and who furthermore created our minds to know that. So this is a coherent package of views. On the other hand, other people can play the postulation game. Some people might want to postulate an orthodox God of miracles and prophecy, for example. So I think postulation in such momentous context is best avoided or minimized. So Al-Ghazali's foes, the Averroists, or maybe before the letter, are not unlike modern liberal theologians in their invoking a prestigious natural philosophy to exclude things like resurrections. Al-Ghazali faced this problem partly by passing through human induction and a sort of Humean inductive skepticism. We observe constant conjunction. We don't observe necessity. Fire doesn't have to burn cloth, or Abraham in the furnace. And so philosophy does not preclude a literal resurrection. And hence, as the Catholic Church says in Fides et Ratio, perhaps, faith liberates reason from presumption, the typical temptation of the philosopher. St. Paul, the fathers of the church, and closer to our own time, philosophers such as Pascal and Kierkegaard reproach such presumption. So people like Pascal and Kierkegaard are some of the people who would see skepticism as making room for faith. Okay, so I'm going to have to go quickly here. So Ghazali worries about what happens when he introduces a skeptical argument, and who knows, maybe there are wild beasts and raging fires that I can't see. Maybe there is a book in my house that turned into a handsome, efficient slave, or who knows what might have happened. And his response is, next slide, please. His response, so basically he's opened a can of worms with his skeptical argument, and he closes it to his satisfaction by a coherent Orthodox Islamic postulation. God has created within us knowledge that he will not bring about everything that's possible. On the other hand, you might wonder, is there an alternative to this theological postulation, one that does not serve a Averroistic anti-supernaturalism? And then skipping back a bit, perhaps historically, we've seen meta-induction has appealed to the Stoics in defending divination, and it appeals to the Stoics and logical empiricists to defend science. So I think it's interesting to combine the theme of skepticism as an aid to faith with meta-induction as the logic of faith. And you can find elements of both of those in ancient Greek philosophy, but I think rarely combined before now. So again, it's very relevant to consider the disagreement about the past. And Abraham and Sarah found that the divine promise outperformed gynecology. So do people who believe in things like prophecy pay attention to track records? Well, I suspect that tacitly they do, because otherwise, I mean, why would you use such a thing if you don't think it's been working? And I think so yes, there's a short run problem. I'm afraid this talk is longer than I've had the occasion to give before, and it's not quite as clean as it should be. Next slide, please. Okay, and let's go on from there also, please. Okay, so how can inductivists counterattack? And I'm very near the end here. So one way inductivists might counterattack would be Hume's contrary miracles argument. So Hume says evidence for miracles for religion A is evidence against miracles for religion B. But as John Ehrman points out, Hume's argument basically assumes that miracles are invoked to prove doctrines, which is a claim that is no part of inductive logic. Historically, that was a favorite idea of Protestants, of mainstream Protestants who said miracles stopped a long time ago. That was a move they made to reject Catholic miracles regardless of the testimony in favor of them. But this was basically a confessional test for miracle reports. And if you say, I believe in the miracles I like, but not the miracles I don't like, well, that's a game that other people can play too. And someone who doesn't like any miracles can claim to be making the same move, which is in fact what happened increasingly over the centuries. So that's not terribly successful, I think. I think a more interesting counterattack is to appeal to extended track records. So it's not only what the esotericist claims, you don't simply read the Bible and figure out what the track record is, but also look for additional traces of these supposed esoteric events. For example, if the if the book of Numbers and the Pentateuch describes a great describes a multitude in a desert for 40 years, or if Genesis describes a big flood, you can look at rocks and see if geology and archaeology bear out these claims, or on the other hand, undermine them. And thus, it might well be the case, Short's reasons, and I think he thinks this is true, that these esoteric predictive methods actually don't work well at all when you consider a broader track record, not just supposed records in old books, but traces you can find in the rocks. And this, I think, is a very serious point needing further reflection. On the other hand, you might worry that this extended track record itself presupposes induction. Maybe by begging the question over auxiliary hypotheses, because meta-induction is supposed to use only track records, not plausibility judgments, but you need plausibility judgments to decide which testimony or observations to accept. So it seems that we're back with Kohlenhausen's subjective Bayesianism and relativism after all. And perhaps for reasons like this, Birch and Russell worried that science was moonshine unless postulates of scientific inference are known prior to experience. Now I do a lot of physics and I don't generally think that science is moonshine, but I think there's an interesting puzzle here. To conclude, I think the problem of induction from Sextus Empiricus and Hume is both difficult and important to be taken seriously rather than put on a shelf. I think the best approach to answering it is meta-induction, but I think there is an interesting unremarked claim that a historical claim that induction has worked best so far, and most of the people whom one would try to persuade would actually dispute that claim. It's a contested claim. I probably shouldn't have put the Stoics there, but it's at least for the biblical example, because there is occasional predictive rivalry between, say, whether Sarah will give birth to Isaac after menopause or not, and their rival claims about what actually happened. So faith indeed has a logic, at least partly, and it's the same meta-inductive logic as science, which we can see in the Stoics and the logical empiricists. So at least granting empiricism, perhaps there is a good track record vindicating, making further predictions by the same method. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pitts. This was very interesting and stimulating, actually. Thank you very much for that, both on the substantive, technical, philosophical side and the historical side. Very interesting. So again, a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, please raise your hand or write it in the chat. While you guys gather your thoughts, I'm going to start asking the first question, Professor. And it's about a point you touched there at the end about whether the meta-inductive strategy is not presupposing precisely the very same thing that critics of induction complain about. So my worry here is that isn't the meta-inductive strategy presupposing that if predictive method A has worked in the past, then it will likely continue to work in the future? If not, if we're not presupposing that, why, on what grounds do we think that induction is best than other methods? And if we are presupposing that, why is that not the same issue that we see with induction, traditionally with induction?
Yes, good question. Thank you. So, I mean, the pragmatic approach tries to thread a needle, and I think successfully. I mean, the official answer is it isn't probable, and there's no claim that it's probable that induction will work in the future. The claim is that this is the best we can do, and it's it's as good as anything and better than most, or something along those lines. And so there's no claim that induction will likely work, and so it isn't. So that claim is just given up. On the other hand, meta-induction tends to converge on whatever is working, whereas if I were to make all of my predictions by consulting my magic 8-ball or by asking the oracle at Delphi or something along those lines, it's far from clear that there is any sort of convergence there. So meta-induction converges on methods of prediction that have a good track record, and that's the best that we can do. So because meta-induction converges on predictive methods that have a good track record, and anything that's very different from meta-induction will not converge, it's better, meta-induction is better than any alternative. But because it's granted that, because no claim is made that induction will likely work, or even meta-induction will likely work, it does not assume what it was attempting to prove. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure I have wrapped my mind around exactly what is meant by the suggestion that we're not saying that this method will continue to work at all. We're not even saying that it's likely that it will work, but we're still saying, in some sense, that this is the best that we have available. Now, why is this the best if we're not giving any substantive, we're not saying anything substantive about its continuing to work or its likelihood of continuing to work? If we're completely punting on that, then I'm still struggling to understand why this is now just on the par with the Magic 8-ball, which hasn't worked so far, granted, but we're not assuming that the future is going to be similar to the past,
right? Okay.
And since we're not assuming that,
right. So I mean, it may be the case that there is some successful predictive method, and if there is, meta-induction will gradually converge on it. If there isn't, then we're all doomed anyway. But as a practical matter, if there's any success to be had, meta-induction will find it. On the other hand, consulting my Magic 8-ball is not going to converge on a successful predictive method unless the Magic 8-ball is itself successful. So it has no tendency to converge on whatever successful predictive method there might be, if any.
mm-hmm.
The 8-ball doesn't, whereas meta-induction does. So maybe it is possible to predict the future, and if it is, then meta-induction will converge eventually, or approximately, or something along those lines, to the successful method. And so only something that is very similar to meta-induction will do that. I mean, there might be, I mean, it's possible. I mean, if you just happen to have a hotline to God, that will converge much faster than than meta-induction, because you will already know the truth rather than having to slowly recognize its successful track record. But assuming you don't have a hotline to God, but there is some successful way to predict the future, perhaps science, something along those lines, then meta-induction will eventually come to notice that. Whereas consulting my Magic 8-ball will never come to notice that.
Right. Thank you. Ricardo, please.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to know, do you think there is a close relation between the idea of meta-induction presented by you and the idea of the testimony of the Spirit in the Christian religion?
So I see the two as complementary. I think I almost mentioned the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit as a supplement to meta-induction in some versions of Christian epistemology. I think you can find something like the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit in, say, 1 John, for example. I don't see them as similar. I think what you might, if you're a Bayesian, then you might see the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit as changing your degrees of belief in the direction of the truth. And if you're a subjective Bayesianism, that's fine. You're a subjective Bayesian, that's just fine because you've just gotten a free upgrade of your opinions towards the truth in certain areas, not mediated by evidence. Meta-induction, on the other hand, is supposed to be evidence-driven. And so it seems to me that the two are potentially complementary. But I don't think that they're particularly similar, except perhaps in the sense that both of them seem to play a role in at least in some key Christian or Judeo-Christian texts. Well, I'm not sure if the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit is in Jewish text. That would be a harder claim to make, but so I don't think they're very similar, but I think that they are compatible and potentially complementary.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'll ask one more question while perhaps anyone else. Oh, Agnaldo, was that a question? That was you chose the clapping function on your Zoom. Sorry.
I'm sorry. What's the wrong reaction? What's the right reaction in the first place? Actually, to first of all, I'd like to thank you and applause your presentation. My question is something very related to Ricardo's one. Richard Swinburne has defended that the same basic inductive reasoning in Bayesian terms is applicable both to scientific explanation and the theistic personal explanation in natural theology. Do you see your approach and Swinburne's as converging into the same fundamental idea? And if so, what would be the main differences?
Okay, so I think that there are some similarities, but I think that one difference is the approach that I'm envisaging takes with greater seriousness those places where Jewish, Christian, or Islamic believers have perceived some sort of tension between science and faith. So I mentioned Al-Ghazali. Recall the Aristotelian natural philosophers were saying, there's all this necessity, so there can't be miracles. On the other hand, resurrection from the dead is an important belief in Islam as well as in Christianity, and there are at least instances in the Hebrew Bible. So I think in other words, I think that a person of traditional Abrahamic faith will want to believe in most of induction, but not quite all of it. And if one is simply justifying induction, one is in danger of, or depending on your views, maybe it's an opportunity. But anyway, there is the tendency to eliminate things like resurrections and other miracles because the uniformity of nature excludes such things as dead people ceasing to be dead and that sort of thing. So I think that induction is a little, and of course you need something approaching induction in order to get through life. But if you have exceptionalist induction, then you have moved away from Orthodox Abrahamic belief into some sort of liberal theology or naturalism or something along those lines. So I think that there is not always as much awareness of the risks of induction in maybe that aspect of Swinburne's project as you would find in the some of the thinkers whom I have mentioned and been inspired by.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I'll ask another question while we're waiting here. What do you think about the complications for a meta-inductive argument here, or even for a simple inductive argument here, looking at track record in scriptures when we consider two pieces of information, one that there's a chance that scriptures record a biased sample of the data, including mostly correct predictions and leaving out various incorrect predictions. And the second piece of information reinforcing that is that we are familiar in contemporary times and in the historical records post the establishment of the canon. We're familiar with very many predictions made by religious traditions, made by the Judeo-Christian tradition, by specific people who have failed to materialize. So do you think that those concerns about representativeness and completeness of the data produce a serious worry for using this strategy in this context?
So I think if one were trying to give a very detailed meta-inductive argument and try to infer simply from that some sort of Orthodox Abrahamic faith, that would be a difficult thing to do for reasons, including ones that you're mentioning. I mean, of course, the Hebrew Bible records lots of false prophecies and warns about them. But there is the claim that it's only the bad guys who have false prophecies, and the good guys don't have false prophecies, unless, of course, they're conditional, in which case they're not false after all. Like if God says, I'll hammer you, and then you repent, and then he doesn't hammer you, that's supposed to be okay. So, I mean, there certainly is that potential. I think one's judgment of the character of the writers will play a role, and probably a lot of considerations will play a role. I think I think what meta-induction is useful for is a couple things. One, it allows you to say, here is it allows you to see that there is something that is at least a broadly logical process that people are engaging in, even in the least promising cases. I think, some people who are not very reverent think, the story of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac is ludicrous. Like I read somewhere saying, like, what do you think if your next door neighbor acted like this? And you'd want him imprisoned, right? So it's a pretty unpromising situation by ordinary standards. But and yet if it makes some sense meta-inductively due to Abraham's life experience as reported in the text, then he at least would know. So another thing to say is, part of what you can say is the characters in the story are behaving in ways that make more sense than you would have thought. Whether the real world included such things or not. And the people who wrote these stories managed to come up with some pretty clever reasoning, which, by the way, is the best that we currently have for justifying science, at least according to the logical empiricists. And that in itself is already interesting. It's not straightforward to get from, I read it in this old book, to therefore everyone should believe in it. One's probably going to wind up with some sort of personal subjective tendency in places. I mean, I'm a subjective Bayesian on the whole, and so that doesn't really surprise me. I mean, it would be surprising. I mean, if meta-induction actually worked without admitting any opinions, then that would be in itself a remarkable contribution to Bayesianism. And I don't think that there is such, and if that were true, then Cullenhausen would be wrong, that there isn't really an answer. I think, so you can see a few things. Here are some people who seem to be doing crazy things, but it actually kind of makes sense, or at least here are some characters doing so. Here are some ancient people who had some surprisingly clever reasoning. And it suggests the tradition is sensitive to evidence in ways that both critics like Twain and sort of left-handed complimenters like the later Wittgenstein have not appreciated. And it also allows one to portray liberal theology as a coherent option rather than as the only as the only possibility. I don't think one can probably infer anything a whole lot stronger than that. So, I mean, all those detailed worries that you mentioned are quite real.
Thank you. Any last questions? Well, let me thank you, Professor Pitts, for your time. This was a very stimulating and interesting talk. Thank you very much. I think we've reached our time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So let's go to the next session, right? In how many time?
I believe there
How
should be a
much?
30-minute. There should be a 30-minute break now before the beginning of the next section.
Yes, you can use the link available in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Giselle, please stop the stream.